Hello YouTube! I recently uploaded a video on external world skepticism, in particular the attempt to use inference to the best explanation in response to it. In this video I'm going to look at a different response to skepticism, a notorious argument from G.E. Moore. So Moore gives what he calls a proof of the external world, and it goes like this. He first holds up one hand and says, "Here is one hand," then he holds up the other hand and says, "Here is another hand," and from these two propositions we can derive that there are at least two objects in the external world, because hands are external world objects, and from this it follows that the external world exists. So that is Moore's famous proof of the existence of the external world. Now, this argument is, Moore says, valid. The premises entail the conclusion. Moreover, he says that the premises are warranted. Indeed, they are as warranted as any claim could possibly be. I mean, I hold up my hand and I say, "Here is a hand." How could any proposition have a better justification than that? Clearly, you can see, I know I have hands. And from this, we can see that the external world skeptic is wrong. We have a valid argument with warranted premises, which shows that there is an external world, and indeed that the external world contains the kind of objects we always thought it did. So, by analogy, Moore says, consider the proposition when I'm reading a book. Suppose I say, there are 3 misprints on page 7, and then somebody asks me to demonstrate the truth of this proposition. What would I do? Well, I would show them the page, and then I would point out, hey, here's one misprint, here's the other, and here's the other. That's a perfectly adequate answer to their request. It's about as good an answer for anything that anybody could possibly give. So similarly, if somebody asks us to demonstrate that there is an external world, well, you just point to objects in the external world. It's the same kind of thing. Now, although Moore himself didn't frame it in exactly this way, Moore's style of argument has become known as the Moorean shift, and there's a sort of more general way, I guess, of framing what Moore is doing here. So, recall the classic skeptical argument. If I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, I don't know I have hands. I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, so I don't know I have hands. You don't have to use brain in a vat, of course. You can use any skeptical hypothesis you like. Maybe you're dreaming, maybe you're in the Matrix, maybe you're being deceived by an evil demon, whatever. But what Moore does is essentially just reverses the argument. So he will say, okay, if I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat, I don't know I have hands, but I do know I have hands, so I know that I'm not a brain in a vat. That is, I know that premise 2 is false. Premise 2 of the skeptic's argument is false. So, in my experience, most people find Moore's argument somewhat bewildering, at least when they first encounter it. I mean, initially it seems like it just obviously begs the question against the skeptic. To respond to an argument for external world skepticism by simply asserting that you have hands, that seems to amount to just ignoring the skeptical challenge rather than answering it. And I mean, the problem is that I am in a position to endorse Moore's argument only if I already know that I'm not a brain in a vat, right? Like, because if I haven't already established that, then that removes the support that my perceptual experiences provide for the claim that I do know I have hands. So, by asserting here is a hand, or I know I have hands, Moore is just assuming that the skeptical hypotheses, like the brain in a vat hypothesis, are false. And in other contexts, I mean, the Moorean argument does look pretty hopeless. So, suppose you were to show me a set of photographs of what looks like a piece of blue paper. I might then conclude, okay, these are photographs of a piece of blue paper. The paper is blue. But then you point out that there are various alternative hypotheses. Maybe it is white paper under blue lights. Or maybe it was a picture of white paper that has been manipulated. They've changed it in the editing to make it look blue. We might imagine a kind of Moorean argument here, where somebody says, in response to these alternative hypotheses, somebody says, well, look, here's one photograph of blue paper, here's another photograph of blue paper, so the paper is blue, so it's not white paper under blue lights. Or they'd say, well, if I don't know that this is white paper under blue lights, then I don't know the paper is blue, but I do know the paper is blue, because, hey, look, here's some photographs of blue paper, so I know it's not white paper under blue lights. These arguments, these proofs of blue paper, would be clearly stupid. And it seems like Moore's doing exactly the same thing in his argument against the skeptic. However, Moore's point is, I think, a little more sensible than this. William Lycan, in his article Moore Against the New Skeptics, provides a very useful discussion of the structure of Moore's argument. So, suppose that somebody offers a valid argument for a surprising conclusion, right? So we've got a set of premises, premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, etc., and then the conclusion, the surprising conclusion. Now, when an argument is valid, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So what this argument shows is that it cannot be the case that the premises are true and the conclusion false. Okay, so do you have to accept the conclusion? Well, no, of course not. You can't both accept the premises and deny the conclusion, right? But you can deny the conclusion while also denying one of the premises. So if we take any valid argument for skepticism, right, we're not forced to accept the skeptical conclusion, right? We're forced to either accept the skeptical conclusion or deny one of the premises. Now, that might seem like a trivial point, but it has a very significant consequence, because what this means is that, as Lycan puts it, and I quote, "A deductive proof can be no more than an invitation to compare plausibility. Of the propositions P1, P2, P3, etc., and the denial of the conclusion, which is the least plausible?" Right, so that's the question we have to ask. So the skeptic has given an argument with a bunch of premises leading to the conclusion, I don't know that I have hands. But surely, Moore thinks, the proposition that I know I have hands is as secure as any proposition could be. I am as confident in that as I am in anything. It's certainly far more secure than any of the philosophical propositions that the skeptic appeals to in the premises of her argument. So whatever the details of the skeptical argument, we can say that the denial of the conclusion is more plausible than accepting the premises. And this is why it's reasonable to perform the Moorean shift with respect to common sense propositions like, I know I have hands. The premises of Moore's argument are more plausible, right? It's more plausible to start from the assumption that you know you have hands, right, and then conclude that one of the skeptic's premises must be false. Of course, this is not the case with the blue paper argument. In that case, the denial of the conclusion is not more plausible than accepting the premises of the blue paper skeptic argument. So let's give a specific example of this, right? A common skeptical premise is something along these lines. In order for S to know that P, S must know the falsity of all the propositions incompatible with P. Well, that seems pretty plausible. That's a pretty compelling principle. And given this principle, we might argue that it follows that in order for me to know that I have hands, I must know the falsity of all the skeptical hypotheses, such as the brain in a vat hypothesis. But now consider, what is more plausible, this principle or the proposition, I know I have hands? Well, for Moore, there's just no question. Of course I know I have hands. Nothing can be more plausible than that. That claim is far more secure than any piece of philosophy, than any abstract philosophical principle. So rather than use some set of premises containing that epistemic principle to derive the conclusion that I don't know I have hands, the more reasonable argument is to assert that I do know I have hands, and then to derive that at least one of those premises must be false. So, in fact, we need not identify exactly where the skeptical argument goes wrong. Of course, this is an interesting question, but Moore's argument against skepticism works even if we haven't yet figured out exactly where the skeptic has made a mistake. We know that the skeptic must go wrong somewhere because her argument will contain premises that are less plausible than the assertion that I know I have hands. So Moore's argument rests on common sense propositions like I know I have hands. And it's tempting to say that Moore's proof of the external world only works if he can give a proof of this proposition. For Moore, however, this is this is confused. He says, well, look, of course I can't give a proof that I have hands, at least not in the sense of offering a deductive argument for the proposition which appeals to premises of which I have greater confidence than I do in the proposition that I know I have hands. And this is because, as noted, I'm already as confident in the proposition that I know I have hands as I am in anything whatsoever. So a proof of, like trying to prove that claim would just be ineffective. But for precisely the same reason, we can be sure that the proposition I know I have hands will always win the plausibility comparison with any skeptical proposition. Really this just, I suppose, amounts to the point that, all arguments have to terminate somewhere, and the best place to terminate is with those propositions of which we are maximally confident. So, yeah, that is the basic structure of the Moorean argument, right? Essentially what Moore is saying is, look, a claim like I know I have hands is going to be more plausible than any philosophical proposition that the skeptic uses in an argument to the effect that I don't know I have hands. So, rather than starting with those contentious philosophical principles, we should just start with the most plausible claim, the claim that I know I have hands. And then we can derive that the skeptic goes wrong somewhere. It's worth noting that Moorean arguments have been used in various other contexts, not just against the external world skeptic, but against many other philosophically revisionary positions. Moral realists sometimes use Moorean arguments in defense of moral facts. A moral realist might say that a proposition such as torturing children is morally wrong, or you ought not to torture children, they might say that's far more obvious, far more plausible than any philosophical proposition in an argument to the effect that there are no moral facts. So even if we can't identify exactly where the moral anti-realist goes wrong, we can be confident that she's gone wrong somewhere. Or mathematical realists will say a proposition such as there are infinite even numbers, or infinite prime numbers, or whatever, is far more plausible than any philosophical proposition in an argument to the effect that mathematical objects such as numbers do not exist. Or realists about the mind might say, in response to eliminative materialism, propositions such as I believe there is chocolate cake in the cupboard, or, when you hit people in the face, they tend to become angry, and so on. Those sorts of propositions are far more plausible than any philosophical proposition in an argument to the effect that beliefs and desires and other mental states don't exist. And you can see how this is going to apply to other cases. There are a lot of philosophers who have been convinced on the basis of Moorean arguments that philosophical argument cannot overturn common sense beliefs. Of course, our focus is on the case of external world skepticism, but, just worth noting, as I say, that this is a style of argument that has been applied in many other contexts. Right, let's turn to some problems for Moore's argument. So, a first question here is just why should we think that there are these common sense propositions, let's say, that have this special epistemic status? So, Moore's argument kind of rests on this idea that there are common sense propositions like I know I have hands, which are secure enough that they just cannot be overthrown by philosophical arguments. And so, the question is, why is this? So one initial option, and I guess this is the way I've framed this so far, is to frame it in terms of just intuitive plausibility. We might say that common sense propositions are those that intuitively strike us as very, very plausible. They intuitively strike us as obvious, right, before we've ever engaged in any kind of sophisticated theorizing, and those propositions are going to have a special status for that reason. Unfortunately, it's not entirely clear why intuitive plausibility or intuitive obviousness should make a difference. Here's a nice example from Susanna Renard in her article Why Philosophy Can Overturn Common Sense. She gives the example of these two propositions. So proposition A, there are more positive integers than there are positive even integers. And then proposition B, two sets x and y have the same cardinality just in case there is a one-to-one mapping from the elements of x to the elements of y. These propositions are incompatible. Now, intuitively, A is more plausible than B. Indeed, A might seem initially just obviously true, right? I mean, just, You just look at a list, like just, list out the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can just see directly, like you can almost directly see that there are more positive integers than there are positive even integers. Like clearly the evens are a smaller set. So B must be false, and A must be true. But actually, reflection on these propositions, when we work out their consequences, shows us that A is false and B is true, because of a peculiar property of infinity. And maybe this is the case with Moorean propositions. Indeed, it seems like this is exactly what happens, right? So initially, it seems just obvious that I know I have hands, but then I start reflecting on the skeptical arguments, and that undermines my confidence. It seems like a similar thing as is happening with these mathematical claims, right? Like there's something that strikes me as intuitively obvious, but then when you start reflecting on it, your confidence is shaken. So just appealing to like intuitiveness is probably not going to help explain why we should give common sense this special status. An alternative approach is to say that common sense propositions are special because they are psychologically irresistible. So the thought here is that there are certain beliefs that, in practice, we just can't give up. Even though we might find the arguments against them seductive, like we're stuck with them. We just can't give them up. I mean, this is a point that's made quite nicely by Hume. Hume produced a number of very powerful skeptical arguments against the external world, against the self, against reason in general. And he says, like, if you're engaging in philosophical inquiry, these arguments seem very powerful. But sooner or later, you return to the normal activities of everyday life. And in that context, certain beliefs will just reassert themselves. When I go out for a drink with friends, or I think in Hume's case it was, playing billiards with friends or something like that, when I do those sorts of things, I don't have any serious doubt that I have hands, that there is a glass in front of me, that I'm interacting with other people. Moreover, the argument may be that if I did give up all of these beliefs, if I genuinely suspended judgment about all of this stuff, I would be paralyzed. I would have no grounds on which to perform any particular actions. I would have no idea what to do in order to achieve any goals. So like at the moment, let's say I feel thirsty and okay, I can see a cup in front of me. I believe that the cup is filled with water. I believe the water will quench my thirst rather than poison me. So I take a sip of the water. But imagine if I just had no beliefs at all about the external world. I would have no idea whether the water would quench my thirst or poison me. Indeed, I would have no idea whether there's even a cup there. I'd have no idea whether moving my arm towards the cup would allow me to pick up the cup, or would make my arm like set on fire, or whatever random event. So the claim might be that common sense beliefs are those beliefs that are like irresistible in this sense, that they're beliefs that kind of impose themselves upon us no matter what the force of the skeptical arguments against them. And they're beliefs that we kind of have to have in order to act. So this does give us an answer as to why common sense beliefs would have a special epistemic status. There is some sense in which, if there are indeed beliefs that are irresistible in this sense, then okay, they can't be undermined by philosophical argument, no matter how clever the argument is. I think a big problem with this approach in this context, though, is that it just doesn't capture the kind of beliefs that Moore will need in order to defeat the external world skeptic. Because, I can suspend judgment about whether there's an external world. Indeed, I can like outright accept, say, that I'm a brain in a vat, and I could still, engage in successful action. I could still reach out for the cup when I'm thirsty, because I could think of my life as analogous to a computer game. When you play a computer game, you know that the images on the screen do not represent like an external world, but you still have various beliefs about what will happen when you perform actions within the game. Maybe it's, I don't know, like a game where you get into a car, and if you press a button on the controller, the car will turn left, maybe it will crash into a wall, then you lose the game, right? Like you can approach life in general the same kind of way. So I don't need to believe that I really have hands in the sense of there being external world objects. Maybe my hands are simulated. Even so, I know that if I place my simulated hands on a simulated stove, I'm going to experience some severe pain, so I better avoid doing that. So it's just not clear that beliefs about the external world, in the sense that Moore had in mind, are actually psychologically irresistible. Okay, a third way to defend the special epistemic status of common sense is to appeal to epistemic conservatism. The general idea of epistemic conservatism is that you are justified in continuing to believe whatever it is you already find yourself believing. So if you already believe that P, then in the absence of defeaters, you are justified in continuing to believe that P. Or if it seems to you that P, then in the absence of defeaters, you are justified in continuing to believe that P. Now, I mean, common sense propositions obviously are, well, they're part of common sense. So everybody already finds themselves believing many of these propositions. Like when you're, as you come into the world, inculcated with certain beliefs through education, and among that is a set of certain basic common sense propositions. And since I already believe these propositions, then on epistemic conservatism I have some justification for continuing to do so. I need not give any special argument for such propositions. It's up to those who doubt such propositions to provide the evidence against them. So maybe this can tell us why common sense propositions should be given such heavy weight, let's say. But notice, of course, that a key point about epistemic conservatism is that we're justified in holding such beliefs in the absence of defeaters. This is a very important point. It would be totally implausible to say that, if you already believe that P, then you're justified in continuing to believe it no matter what the evidence against it, right? So it's as long as you have the absence of defeaters. The problem is that the skeptic thinks that we do have defeaters for belief in the external world. That's the whole point of skeptical arguments. The point of such arguments is to undermine the support that my experiences give to propositions such as, I know that I have hands. Now, granted, the skeptic does not point to new evidence, but there are different kinds of defeaters for beliefs. So suppose that I'm examining ice core data of temperature in the past, and on the basis of this data, I say that global CO2 concentrations 5,000 years ago were 300 parts per million. Okay, now one kind of defeater for this is that I might gather more evidence against it. So maybe, for instance, I look at tree ring data and it contradicts the hypothesis. It suggests that it was actually 350 parts per million. And I might look at various other sources of data, and if enough sources of evidence point to the 350 parts per million figure, I might decide that this outweighs the ice core data. So in this case, the ice core data supports the proposition CO2 concentrations 5,000 years ago were 300 parts per million, but this is outweighed by other sources of evidence. Alternatively, another way that this might be defeated, suppose I discover that a significant number of ice cores have been stolen and replaced by fakes, though I don't know which ones are fake and which ones are real. The fakes are very, very convincing. They are indistinguishable from the real ones. Well, in this case, the support that my original ice core data gave to the proposition is undermined. So I haven't gathered evidence which suggests a different figure, right? It's just that the evidence I had for the original figure has been undermined, and so I may give up my belief in this proposition. In fact, I probably should give up my belief in that proposition, even without gathering any further evidence against it, because once I've found that actually the ice cores I'm using as data may just be forgeries, that undermines my belief. And it would hardly be convincing in this situation to say, well, I already believe that CO2 concentrations 5,000 years ago were 300 parts per million, so I'm justified in continuing to hold that belief. That would be a ridiculous response. And this is because that belief is based on the ice core data. But the support that the ice core data lends to that belief is undermined by the discovery of the ice core forgery. Even if you know that only some of them are forgeries, maybe the ice cores I've been using are real ones, right? But once I find out that some of them have been forged, that undermines my belief. And this is analogous to the situation with the skeptic. By drawing our attention to skeptical hypotheses, such as the brain in the vat hypothesis or the evil demon hypothesis or whatever, the skeptic undermines the support that our experiences lend to propositions such as I have hands. So yeah, it's not clear that appealing to principles like epistemic conservatism is going to help here, because it seems like the skeptic has actually provided us with a defeater for our belief, or at least that's how the skeptic is going to see it. So yeah, I mean, a general issue then with the Moorean argument is that it grants common sense propositions this very special, very strong epistemic status, but explaining just why these propositions have this special status turns out to be pretty tricky. Now, of course, we might say that actually no explanation is really required for Moore's argument to work. I mean, we might say that, look, we just do have a greater confidence in a proposition like I know I have hands, even if we can't explain why we have a greater confidence, or even if we can't explain why that confidence is justified. But that doesn't seem like it's not a very satisfying answer. If we're going to say that there's a certain set of propositions that have such a special status, we want to say something about why that is. And yeah, just turns out to be kind of tricky to do that. Okay, a further problem is the problem of dogmatism. So, however we define common sense, it's going to turn out that our common sense beliefs have been overthrown many times in the past. Our current picture of the world is totally at odds with what was common sense 500 years ago, and their picture of the world was totally at odds with what was common sense 2,000 years ago. So, it was once common sense that the Earth is the static centre of the universe, that the cosmos was created by God, that women have inferior cognitive capacities to men, that organisms are spontaneously generated from non-living matter, and so on. And yet these common sense beliefs have been overthrown. And so, this does seem to kind of undermine the idea that common sense beliefs should be granted a special epistemic status. If we had all been Mooreans in the past, centuries of scientific progress would never have occurred. Because, after all, those people in the past could have said, well, the common sense proposition that women have inferior cognitive capacities, that is far more plausible than the technical premises of the feminists' arguments. So yeah, it seems like the Moorean is just committed to this kind of dogmatism of kind of pig-headedly like holding beliefs in the face of compelling argument and evidence. So one response to this is given by William Lycan in the previously mentioned article, who suggests that Moore was never dogmatic in the sense of claiming that common sense beliefs could never be overturned. In particular, Moore was happy with the idea that common sense can be corrected by scientific investigation. And this is because scientists can gather empirical evidence against common sense beliefs. Empirical evidence is ultimately grounded in propositions that are just as plausible, just as obvious as the common sense propositions challenged by the evidence, that might be challenged by that evidence, because empirical evidence is grounded in direct observation. The empirical evidence against spontaneous generation, for instance, that ultimately consists in direct observations of changes in swan-necked flasks, for example. So it's fine to try to we can undermine common sense by appealing to empirical evidence. Philosophers, however, do not produce empirical evidence. When philosophers produce skeptical arguments to the effect that, for instance, nobody knows the external world exists, they must be appealing to abstract metaphysical or epistemological principles. So as Lycan puts it, the point is, and I quote, "No purely philosophical premise can ever legitimately have as strong a claim to our allegiance as can a humble common sense proposition such as Moore's autobiographical ones." So, such as, I know that I have hands. And, yeah, I mean, this is because no purely philosophical principle, even if it strikes us as true, can possibly be more plausible than the proposition that I know I have hands. So yeah, this is the response to the problem of dogmatism, right? The target of the Moorean argument are philosophical arguments against common sense. It doesn't generalize to scientific research. I think, however, that we can state a dilemma for the Moorean at this point. So the question is, does common sense include principles of theory choice, or like general epistemic principles that tell us how to update our beliefs? So, for example, a principle such as do not multiply entities beyond necessity, or if you believe that P and you believe that P entails Q, then infer that Q. Does common sense include principles like this? Well, suppose we deny this. Suppose we say that common sense consists only of propositions describing the world, propositions like I have hands, and so on, and that principles of theory choice are not part of common sense. Well, in that case, it's hard to see how common sense could ever be overthrown, even by the sciences. And this is because the sciences can only overthrow common sense if we assume certain abstract principles of theory choice, like the principle that simpler theories should be preferred, that you should not multiply entities beyond necessity or whatever. These are philosophical principles, but we need them if we are to draw any conclusions about the world from our investigation of it. This is a point made by Renard in Why Philosophy Can Overturn Common Sense. And I think an easy way to see this point is to note that for any scientific theory, it's possible to treat it as simply a useful tool for describing one's experiences. We might think that our best scientific theories correctly describe what we experience, but we should be agnostic concerning any claims they make beyond experience. On this kind of anti-realist interpretation, science just can't tell us, say, that the world was not created 6,000 years ago, or that spontaneous generation does not occur. I mean, yes, we may well think that creationism is absurd, but there's nothing logically inconsistent about holding that the world was created 6,000 years ago and that things were set up by God to appear as if they were older. So, let's say like it was once common sense that the world was created 6,000 years ago, and then the empirical evidence comes in of fossils and so on. Well, you can just resist that by saying, well, God made it appear older. It was created 6,000 years ago, but God just set things up to make it look as if it were older. So to kind of get any purchase against that position, it looks like we're going to have to start appealing to principles of theory choice, to metaphysical or epistemological principles. In general, to suppose that our best scientific theories describe reality, that is in itself a philosophical position, and there are actually substantive arguments against that position. So yeah, the point is this, right? If science is to overthrow common sense, we have to suppose that it provides us with true descriptions of reality. But we can only hold that position if we endorse certain principles of theory choice. And if principles of theory choice are never part of common sense, then it looks like, on the Moorean view, science actually is powerless against common sense. Because, hey, common sense is always going to be more plausible than any abstract epistemological principle, right? The common sense belief that the world was made 6,000 years ago, that is far more plausible than any epistemological principle you might be using to try to argue for a world that's billions of years old. So yeah, this is the first horn of the dilemma. If common sense does not include principles of theory choice, it's not clear how, on the Moorean view, common sense could ever be overthrown. Okay, second horn of the dilemma. Let's say the Moorean grants that principles of theory choice can be part of common sense. Well, now the skeptic has a really easy response. She can say that the philosophical principles used in her argument are principles of common sense. And that actually seems pretty plausible. So, think about a principle like, if the empirical evidence doesn't decide between P and not P, we should suspend judgment between P and not P. So, since our evidence doesn't decide between the common sense hypothesis and the brain in the vat hypothesis, right? Since all of our experiences are entirely compatible with both hypotheses, we should suspend judgment about them. I mean, that is intuitively a pretty appealing principle. And even if that specific principle is rejected, it looks like something in the ballpark of that principle should be part of common sense. I mean, we do seem to use a principle along these lines to guide our reasoning in everyday life. But now it's going to turn out that the skeptical argument is not a conflict between, you know, everyday common sense and abstract philosophical principles. It's a conflict within common sense, right? It turns out that certain commitments of common sense, you know, so let's say the sort of basic beliefs that we have, right? The common sense beliefs we have, certain commitments of common sense conflict with certain other commitments of common sense. Like the beliefs that we have conflict with the common sense principles that we employ to decide what beliefs to hold. So, you know, the Moorean argument just fails, right? Skepticism is just part of common sense. And actually, I mean, this makes sense of how simple and compelling the skeptical argument seems. Most people, at some point or another, have probably felt the force of such arguments. I mean, I remember considering skeptical arguments when I was literally a child, long before I engaged with philosophy academically. I remember asking myself, like, how do I know I'm not dreaming? Or how do I know I'm not in the Matrix? And I was troubled that I couldn't come up with a convincing answer. Skeptical worries are not, you know, abstract philosophy. As soon as most people turn their attention to these skeptical questions, they find it at least enticing, even if they're not ultimately convinced. So, the point is, on this approach then, even if we agree with the Moorean that common sense has this special epistemic status, well, arguably we can't really use that against skepticism because skeptical worries are part of common sense. So yeah, that's the dilemma, right? If we take principles of theory choice to be excluded from common sense, then the Moorean is committed to an implausible dogmatism on which common sense beliefs can never be overthrown. On the other hand, if principles of theory choice can be part of common sense, then the skeptic has a pretty good argument that skepticism just follows from the commitments of common sense. Okay then, the final objection that I will outline is given by Roger White in his article Problems for Dogmatism. White argues that Moore's position has implausible consequences for our degrees of confidence in our beliefs. So let's say that I hold up my hand and say, this is a hand, right? So it appears to me as if this is a hand. Now, if Moore is right, then on the basis of this appearance, I gain justification for the claim that this is not a simulated hand. That is, it's not an image of a hand being created for my envattered brain by a sophisticated machine. If I gain justification for a proposition, then my confidence in that proposition should increase. So, on being presented with the appearance of a hand, my confidence in the proposition, this is not a simulated hand, should increase. But White says this is surely wrong. In fact, my confidence in that proposition should decrease, and my confidence in its contrary, this is a simulated hand, should increase. Because the contrary is exactly how things would appear, right? Like, this is exactly how things would appear if I were a brain in a vat and it were creating the simulation of a hand. So, when I'm presented with the appearance of a hand, I have acquired evidence in favour of the proposition that this is a simulated hand. And White says this is something that even the anti-skeptic should agree on. It may be that in the end we have good reasons to reject the proposition that this is a simulated hand, but the point is that I'm currently experiencing exactly what I would experience were I presented with a simulated hand, and that is evidence for the proposition that it is a simulated hand. So White gives this analogy. Imagine I am to be put under anaesthetic, while the doctor will take one of three cards. One of three cards will be randomly selected to determine what happens to my hands. So card A says, chop off Kane's hands and replace them with fake ones, which, of course, are completely indistinguishable from real hands. Card B is, do nothing, leave him alone. Card C is chop off Kane's hands and leave the stumps. So one of these is drawn at random, the instructions followed. Now, when I wake up, I find that my arms are still under the sheets and they're still numb from the anaesthetic. What is my confidence in the proposition I do not have fake hands. Well, surely it should be 2/3, because I do not have fake hands will be true whether card B was selected or whether card C was selected. So I do not have fake hands is true if I have real hands, and it's true if I have neither real hands nor fake hands. Right? So given my current situation where I have no evidence, I can't see my hands at all, or at least I can't see what's going on at the end of my arms. Given that situation, any of these three cards might have been selected, so I should have a probability of 2/3 in the proposition I do not have fake hands. Now, an hour later, I am able to move my arms, so I lift them up and I see what looks like hands at the end of them. Well, I can now rule out option C. The doctor didn't chop off my hands and leave stumps. Rather, I now know that I either have fake hands, as in card A, or I have real hands, as in card B. So my credence in the proposition I do not have fake hands drops to 1/2. So the observation that I have what appears to be hands at the end of my arms increases my confidence both in the proposition I have hands and in the proposition I have fake hands. And notice that changing the number of cards doesn't make any difference here. So we might include hundreds of card Bs. So there's hundreds and hundreds of outcomes where I have real hands. I guess that would be analogous to the anti-skeptic's position, right? The anti-skeptic is confident that our perception provides a veridical picture of the world, that my hands are not part of a simulation or anything like that. So that corresponds to hundreds of card Bs. Now, that will, obviously that would change my precise degree of confidence, but the general result holds. On observing that I appear to have hands, my confidence in the proposition I do not have fake hands should decrease, because that observation rules out card C. It rules out one of the situations in which I don't have fake hands. This seems really like a pretty obvious point. If you take the hypothesis that, take the hypothesis that I am a brain in a vat which is simulating the experience of hands, or the hypothesis that I'm asleep, dreaming that I have hands. Well, when I observe my hands, that does seem to support these hypotheses in a pretty straightforward way. My observation of the appearance of hands raises the probability that these hypotheses are correct. And again, you don't need to be a skeptic to agree with this. It just rests on the idea that when we make an observation, where that observation is entailed by a hypothesis, that should raise our credence in that hypothesis. But on the Moorean view, when I observe the appearance of hands, that raises my confidence in the hypothesis that I have real hands, but lowers my confidence in the hypothesis that I have simulated hands, or that I'm dreaming that I have hands, or that, there's an evil demon making me think I have hands, or whatever, for every other skeptical hypothesis. And so White says that's just the wrong result. That's not how our degrees of confidence should work. Okay, so that's all for today. I hope you found that interesting. I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.